Episode 1. You're going to inherit far more than money. Hello, my name is Alexander von der Fellen, and welcome to this podcast. This is for you if you're connected to family wealth or a family enterprise, not because you chose it, but because you were born into it. You may feel part of it already, or approaching that point. You've probably been asked to listen to this. Or maybe you're already aware that it will all matter a lot more than it does today, but it's not yet clear precisely in what way. This series came about because of a remarkable young woman who found herself in a position not unlike yours. Let's call her Clara. Clara is the heiress to a substantial European enterprise and a well-known global consumer brand. She grew up surrounded by wealth and beautiful surroundings, educated in Swiss boarding schools, experiencing fabulous vacations, but also experiencing early the negatives that substantial wealth can also bring. Divorced, often absent parents, and friendships shaped by who she was rather than the person she was becoming. Self-harm, extensive periods of therapy, a distance from normal life that even she recognized. After all, she took her first ride on public transport with me. I recently completed a period of mentorship with Clara, one that she initiated. 15 relaxed, easy sessions. At our final session, she thanked me for making so many things clear and asked whether what we had discussed could be made available to others like her. Not as advice, but as orientation, because it might help them as she sensed that it was helping her. This series is a result and is based on our condensed session notes. As I say, 15 easy, 30-minute episodes, and I hope it helps you too. In spite of the fact that I've been around wealth for almost half of my life, I was not contacted in order to teach Clara technical knowledge. Not how to analyze a spreadsheet or how to evaluate an investment or even how to organize her tax affairs. She was just looking for orientation. From her perspective, the problem wasn't the money. It was the position she was growing into. She had not chosen the system she was born into. She had not designed the expectations that surrounded her, and yet she could already feel that her life would be shaped by both. She was inside something important. She knew that much. But no one had explained what it actually was and how it actually worked. She sensed that the people around her had interests of their own. Teams of advisors advised. Each family member carried history. Friends often responded to her lifestyle, not to her as a person. It had become difficult to find someone who is neither emotionally entangled nor financially dependent, to explain things to her, someone who could speak plainly, but at the same time compassionately. She was also aware of a rising sense of risk, not dramatic, sudden risk, but a slow drift, a risk of becoming passive, becoming defined by the system, rather than forming a position within it. Watching older generations carry the responsibility without fully understanding how they had even arrived there, and realizing that one day that would probably be her. Mentorship offered something different, not instruction, not direction, but perspective, a way to understand the landscape before learning to make decisions within it. She also wanted discretion, someone outside the family, outside the advisory structure, someone who had seen many families, not just hers, someone who understood patterns, not just personalities, and finally, and perhaps most importantly, she wanted a certain kind of independence for herself, not independence in the rebellion sense, not distance, clarity, to understand what was hers to carry, what was not, and how to build a life that was not simply a continuation of others' expectations. In short, she had sensed something, that inheritance is not just financial, that it is structural, psychological, and relational. And without guidance, it's too easy to drift into a role that you never consciously chose. I had known Clara and her family since she was a child, so it was a pleasure to be asked to help. This series is the result. Now, first of all, let's get one thing out of the way. This is not a series about how wealth is created or even how to do it. It's about what it means to inherit it, as you almost probably do. Not in dry legal terms, in real human terms. There's a big difference between owning something and understanding what to do with it. And that difference is rarely explained in a simple way. Most conversations about wealth tend to happen around you, between your parents, their advisors, trustees, company executives. Decisions are made, structures are built, plans are discussed. But the experience of what it's like being inside that system is often left unspoken. This series is an attempt to make that visible to you, to describe plainly and without jargon what you are likely to encounter as you assume responsibility. Not to instruct you, but to clarify for you, because there is an assumption that sits behind most conversations about wealth, and that is that having it makes life easier. More options, more freedom, fewer constraints. In fact, you're probably agreeing so far. But wealth does not remove complexity, it just changes it. Your life up to now has had a certain shape to it. Money has always been present, but rarely discussed directly. It has just sat there in the background, silently, reliably. Things have always worked as a result, and because they've always worked, there's been no real need to question them. So being asked to listen to something like this can feel unnecessary, or maybe just premature, or simply not that interesting. I get that. That's understandable. Because the reality is that nothing has forced the issue. There has been no moment where someone has had to sit you down and say clearly, this is really important right now. Instead, what has happened was probably more indirect, a suggestion, a recommendation. Why don't you have a listen to this? It might be useful. And so here you are, not because you were looking for this today, but because in some way, life has placed it in front of you. Some years ago, I sat in Tokyo with another person, not very different from you. He was young, well-educated, capable, thoughtful. He had grown up around wealth, but not inside the mechanics. His life had unfolded in a way that felt natural. A good school in the US, the elite Todai University in Tokyo, the start of a career that made sense to him. His parents had managed things efficiently, without involving him in detail, and there'd been no reason to question that, until there was. His father had died. Not unexpectedly, but still abruptly enough that many conversations had not quite happened yet. In the months that followed, things began to change, not dramatically, but steadily. He found himself going to a lot more meetings than before, listening to people whom he had never met before, speaking about structures that had apparently existed for years. They used language that was precise, but not always clear. They referred to decisions that had been made long ago by his father. They spoke with confidence about arrangements that would, from now on, in some way, involve him. He listened carefully, asked a few questions, tried to follow, and for a while he managed, until at one point he just stopped the conversation, not out of frustration, but because something had become clear to him. He said, quite simply, I think I've inherited something that I don't understand. So he asked someone for a recommendation, and I was contacted. There was no embarrassment in it, just recognition. And beneath that, something else, a sense that what was in front of him was not just financial, it was structural, relational, and in a way that he had not anticipated, really, really personal. It's very easy at your stage to think of inheritance in simple terms. At some point in the future, assets will pass to you from your parents. That's an assumption. And because that moment feels distant, It remains abstract, something for later, something that will be dealt with when it arrives. The problem is that that's not quite how it works. What you're connected to now is not just a future transfer of wealth, it's an existing system, one that's already in place, already operating, already shaped by decisions that were made long before you were involved. You may not see it clearly yet, and in some cases, that is intentional. Many families avoid involving the next generation, you, too early. Sometimes out of protection, sometimes out of habit, sometimes because the conversations themselves are not straightforward. So, what you experience instead is the surface, the outcomes, the lifestyle, the continuity, without the underlying structure being fully visible or fully explained to you. And over time, that creates a particular kind of distance, not physical, but conceptual. You're close to it, but definitely not inside it. Because of that distance, an assumption can form in your mind that when the time comes, things will simply, well, continue. That whatever has been put in place will just continue working. That the people involved will handle it, well, like they've always done. That your role, when it arrives, will be absolutely manageable. Not as simple as now, perhaps, but not particularly complicated either. What is passed from one generation to the next, however, is not just financial capital. It's behavior, it's expectation, it's responsibility, and often without any of them being clearly defined. On top of it all, those elements aren't transferred at a single point in time. They emerge gradually, sometimes without even being noticed, sometimes only becoming visible when circumstances change. A death, a transition, a decision that needs to be made and can no longer be deferred. And at that point, the sense of distance begins to close. In fact, very quickly. Now, you could, of course, ignore all of this for a while longer. Many do. There would be no immediate consequence. Life would continue like before, things would function. And from the outside, nothing would require your attention. But what tends to happen in those cases is that understanding is delayed until it becomes absolutely necessary. And when it becomes absolutely necessary, it's often no longer simple because the context is no longer neutral. It's shaped by circumstance, sometimes by loss, sometimes by pressure. And in those moments, the ability to take time, to ask basic questions, to build understanding gradually is very, very limited. That's where you might begin to feel overwhelmed. Not because the situation is unmanageable, but because it's unfamiliar. And unfamiliarity, combined with responsibility, creates a particular kind of tension, one that is avoidable, but only if engagement begins earlier, calmly, without urgency, like today. So it may help for us to think about this differently. Not as something you're being asked to learn, but as something you're already part of, and a sense that you need to understand. Whether you choose to engage with it now or later doesn't really change that. It only changes how prepared you are when it becomes more visible. There's no requirement to master it, no expectation that you suddenly understand everything, but there is value in beginning to orient yourself, to move slowly from being an observer to being a participant, to replace assumption with understanding. Not all at once, but progressively. The reality is quite simple. At some point, this will matter to you, whether you like it or not. It will be important, not in an abstract way, but directly. And when that moment comes, the question will not be whether the system works. It will be whether you understand your role within it. So what happens if you leave this too late? Well, there's a pattern that repeats across families, not immediately, not obviously, but consistently. Everything appears to function well for a long time. Decisions are made, assets are managed, the system holds. And because it holds, there's a tendency to assume that it will continue to do so, without much intervention, without much engagement. But beneath that, something is happening. Understanding is not being built, and where understanding is absent, reliance increases. Reliance on advisors, on structures, on individuals who appear to know how things work. At first, this can actually feel efficient. Why involve yourself in something complex when others are already handling it? Seems very well. Why spend time on something that does not yet seem to require your input? But over time, that distance creates dependency. And dependency in this context is risk. Not because the people involved are necessarily acting incorrectly or dishonestly, but because you're just not in a position to judge. You're present, but not informed, involved, but not grounded. And when a moment comes that requires judgment, that gap becomes painfully visible. Sometimes quite suddenly, a decision needs to be made, a disagreement emerges, an assumption is challenged, and what had previously been handled smoothly now feels, well, less certain. Because you're being asked to engage at a level that you have not yet reached. That is where discomfort begins. Not because the situation is inherently difficult, but because you're encountering it for the first time, under pressure. If you could step back and observe this across different families similar to yours, the patterns are remarkably similar. It's not about location or industry or even the size of the wealth. It's about behavior. One pattern is avoidance. Difficult conversations are delayed. Questions are left unasked, not out of neglect, but out of a preference to maintain ease. Everything appears to function, so there is no immediate reason to introduce complexity. But that ease is temporary. It is maintained by deferring engagement. Another pattern is overconfidence. At some point, individuals assume they understand more than they actually do, not consciously, but because, for all of us, familiarity is sometimes mistaken for comprehension. It happens when people have heard the language, seen the outcomes, attended just enough meetings to feel comfortable, but when tested, the depth of understanding is just not there. And that gap is often only revealed when something changes. Then there is passivity, a sense that involvement is somehow optional, that the system will continue regardless of your level of engagement. And for a time, that's true, until it is not. Because systems do not sustain themselves indefinitely without informed participation. They require attention, not constant, but informed. Finally, there is misalignment between family members, between generations, between expectation and reality. This is rarely explicit at the beginning, but it builds slowly through different interpretations of what is fair, what is appropriate, what is expected. And because these interpretations are not always discussed openly, they remain unresolved until they resurface. Familiarity with these patterns is not the same as understanding, and this is where something subtle happens. You might stop asking certain questions, not because you're certain of the answers, but because you feel you should already know them, or because asking them would somehow slow the conversation down, or risk making you feel stupid, or more simply, because no one else is asking them. Again, this is not unusual. It's a very human response. You feel informed, but you've not been tested. You feel involved, but not yet responsible. And so the gap remains hidden until something happens. It might be an important decision that requires your input, not a major one, but enough that your view is expected. You listen, you consider, and then you realize that forming a clear position is not at all as straightforward as you thought, because you understand the surface, but not yet the structure beneath it. Or it might be a disagreement, a difference of opinion between people who are more experienced than you, each with their own logic, each with their own reasoning, and you find yourself uncertain which view to align with. Not because you lack judgment, but because you lack context. And in that moment, something becomes clearer, not dramatically, but still, it becomes clearer. That what you have understood so far is somehow incomplete, that there's more beneath it, and that until you begin to engage with that depth, you will always remain slightly outside of the real decision making process. It's not a failure, it's a stage. But it is an important one, because this is where people tend to go in one of two directions. Some pull back. They become more passive, more inclined to defer, to rely on those who appear to be more certain, which in the short term feels a lot easier. But in the long term, it just reinforces the gap. Others move in a different direction. They become more deliberate, not necessarily louder, not more assertive, but more attentive. They begin to notice what is not being said as much as what is. They begin to ask questions, even simple ones, and they begin to accept that understanding is something that has to be built, not assumed. Let me get one thing clear. The difference between these two responses is not intelligence. It's willingness. Willingness to sit with uncertainty. Willingness to admit that something is not yet clear. Willingness to engage, even when there is no immediate pressure to do so. This is where the shift begins, and it's not a visible one. No one announces it, no one formally acknowledges it, but over time it changes how you are perceived, and more importantly, how you perceive yourself within the system. You move gradually from being someone who's present to someone who's paying attention. And that is a very different position, because attention over time leads to understanding, and understanding over time leads to confidence. Not the kind of confidence that comes from familiarity, but the kind that comes from clarity. And that is the only kind that holds things when things become more complex. There's also something else that tends to emerge around this stage, a subtle tension between independence and responsibility. At your point in life, today, it's entirely natural to focus on your own path, your work, your interests, your relationships, building something that is just yours, separate from the family. That instinct is not only natural, it's actually necessary. But alongside it, there is something else developing, a connection to a system that is not entirely yours, but not entirely separate either. And I know that managing that balance is not straightforward. Too much distance, and you remain unprepared. Too much involvement, and you risk becoming defined by something that you have not yet fully understood. So the question is not whether to engage, it is how and when. The answer in most cases is gradual. You do not need to choose between your own life and your connection to the family system, but you do need to begin to acknowledge that both exist, and that over time they will intersect more directly. The earlier you become comfortable with that idea, the easier that intersection becomes. Not because it's simple, but just because it's no longer unexpected. So, what does this mean for you? You may not recognize these patterns in your own situation today, or you may recognize parts of them, but not all. That's not the point. The point is that these dynamics are not unusual. They are, in many ways, absolutely predictable. And because they are predictable, they can be navigated, but only if they are seen early enough. At your stage, you're not expected to solve these issues, nor should you try to. That's not your role. But you are in a position to begin understanding them, to notice where conversations are absent, to observe where decisions are made without explanation, to recognize where assumptions are being formed rather than clarified. This is not about becoming critical, it's about becoming aware. There's a difference. There is one shift that matters above all others. It's not technical. It's not about learning structures or terminology. It's about how you position yourself in relation to what you are part of. Up to now, it's been reasonable to remain at a distance, to allow others to handle things, to focus on your own path. And that remains important. But alongside that, there is a gradual shift that needs to take place from distance to engagement. Not full involvement, not control, but engagement, which means paying attention when something is explained, asking when something is unclear, not assuming that understanding will somehow arrive on its own. It also means becoming comfortable with not knowing and being willing to say so. That, more than anything else, accelerates understanding because it allows conversations to begin at the right level rather than at a level that is assumed. So, what can you do practically? There's no need to overcomplicate this at this stage. A few simple actions taken consistently are enough. Start with clarity. If there are structures in place, ask for them to be explained in simple terms, not in technical language, but in principle. What exists, why it exists, how it functions. If the explanation feels complex, ask for it again until it becomes clear. Then, understand who's involved, not just by name, but by role. Who makes decisions? Who advises? Who has discretion? And importantly, who does not? This helps you see where responsibility actually sits, rather than where it appears to sit. Next, begin to observe interactions. How decisions are discussed, how disagreements are handled, whether questions are welcomed or avoided. These small signals tell you a great deal about how the system operates in practice, more than any formal explanation will. You should also begin to read. Read what is put in front of you: reports, summaries, updates. I know it sounds boring, but it's necessary. Over time, familiarity with these will become understanding. And, as I said earlier, understanding becomes confidence. And finally, remain patient. There's absolutely no advantage in rushing this. Depth takes time, but consistency matters. So where are we going with this? I can tell you one thing. If you follow this course of podcasts, something will change, believe me. You will begin to see the structure more clearly. Not all at once, of course, but enough to orient yourself. You will begin to understand the roles people play, the decisions that are being made, the trade-offs that are involved, and importantly, you will begin to understand your own position. Not as an outsider, but not yet as a decision maker either. Something in between, which is exactly where you should be. From there, over time, your involvement can deepen naturally, without forcing it, without stepping into responsibility before you're ready, but also without avoiding it when it arrives. Let's be clear. You did not choose this. You didn't design this system, and you're not expected to understand it immediately, but you are connected to it, whether you like it or not, whether you engage with it now or are forced to engage with it later. And at some point, that connection will become more direct, more visible, more demanding. When that happens, what will matter is not how much you've inherited, but how well you understand what you're part of. Because what you inherit is not just wealth. You will inherit a structure, a set of relationships, and in time, a responsibility. The earlier you begin to understand that, without pressure, the more prepared you will be when it matters, not to control it, but to carry it with some clarity, and perhaps with some intention. So, you made it. The first podcast episode in this series. Have a think about the takeaways I listed, and feel free to get in touch with me if it's raised questions. If not, let's meet again next week to discuss why, in reality, inheriting wealth doesn't bring freedom, it brings pressure. Until then, I am Alexander von der Fell.